Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial for the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Cluster. Tutorial 14 is on Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland. You'll need your AQA anthology and 3 different coloured highlighters. For this tutorial, you'll watch a video of me annotating the poem in which I narrate over the top of, and you'll also answer some questions about the poem to ensure that you have solidified and understood your engagement with that poem. So without further ado, it's time to annotate.
Handlebars and let go for anyone. Take me in and I'll throw out my heart and get a new one. Next thing we're touching, you look at me, it's like you hit me with lightning. Oh, everybody's starry-eyed and everybody glows. Oh, everybody's starry-eyed and my body goes. Whoa, oh, ah, ah, whoa, oh, ah, ah, whoa, oh. And so we burst into colors in carousels, full head first, like paper planes and playground games. Next thing we're touching, you look at me, it's like you hit me with lightning. Oh, everybody's starry-eyed and everybody glows. Oh, 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 everybody's starry-eyed and my body goes. Whoa, oh, ah, ah, whoa, oh, ah, ah, whoa, oh. Next thing we're touching, next thing we're touching, next thing we're in love. Next thing we're touching. Oh, everybody's starry-eyed and everybody glows. Oh, 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 everybody's starry-eyed and my body goes, and my body goes, and my body goes, and my body goes, and my body goes. Whoa, oh, 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 ah, ooh, ooh. I tried hard to make you want me, but we're not supposed to be. And the truth will always haunt me, even though it set me free. And my tears flow like the ocean as they floated in the breeze. They were falling in slow motion and they brought me to my knees. Oh, you're haunting me, taunting me, all in my brain. Turn up the light and now all that remains fills me with doubt, and I'm shouting your name out loud. Why do you want to put me through the pain? I get the feeling I'll never escape. I get high away from the shame of you. Tears on the ground, tears on the pillow. You won't bring me down, and I'll get over you. These tears will get me through, and I'll get over you. I'll get over you.
Okay, so Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland, things to know. The themes that this links to, we have the power of memory. This would be something that you'd be able to link to remains, for example. It also links to the reality of war and the lasting impact of war. And again, that would link well to remains and poppies. It's written in free verse, so no regular rhyme. and it's a narrative poem, so it's narrated by one person. I'm just going to highlight those. So things to know about Beatrice Garland herself. She was a researcher and also teacher in psychological medicine. And I actually think that's quite an interesting thing to know when reading this poem, because this is very much about the psychology of a soldier, which is quite interesting, really. Also just worthy to note that this poem, Kamikaze, is from a collection called The Invention of Fireworks. And within this collection of poems, quite a few of them dealt with the cultural divide between the East and the West. We are very much in this poem introduced to potentially a culture that we're not familiar with. And this, therefore, links to also another key theme, which we'll write down at the top after, which is the power of cultural identity, the idea of you, your sense of belonging because of the culture that you are from, and that, you know, other cultures may not understand, but the power of it. So I'm just going to write that at the top. When we come to study the emigre and checking out my history, Kamikaze would link to these poems with this theme, so it would make good comparison. So let's look at the title. So Kamikaze pilots were Japanese volunteers, and I put volunteers in inverted commas because essentially they didn't necessarily know what they were volunteering for, and their purpose was essentially to give their lives to destroy the enemy. They were World War II soldiers, and their purpose was to crash their plane into enemy ships. So they were what we would consider now to the label a suicide bomber, a suicide pilot. That's what a kamikaze pilot was. The word kamikaze in Japanese means divine wind. And again, just consider that translation as we read this and how you could make that relevant. So to begin, her father embarked at sunrise. We instantly understand that we are not hearing from the soldier's voice himself. This is actually the daughter of the pilot. So it's her testimony. It's not his voice. And we have another female perspective on war. However, what you will find is that this deals less with war in the kind of battlefield sense, and more to do with the impact of choice. The word embarked is ambiguous because on the one hand, to embark is to board a plane. So this suits obviously his role as a kamikaze pilot. He would have embarked, he would have boarded his plane at sunrise, so at the start of the day. The second meaning is to go on an adventure, to embark on an adventure. Now this could be about self-discovery for him, or indeed, as we know what a kamikaze pilot does, an adventure of death. We then have, with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. So we have this list here of all of the things that he takes with him. And this list sort of reflects the methodical routine that war never changes. But we have some images here that are important. So samurai sword and a shaven head, things considered very much symbolic of a kamikaze soldier, representing conformity and dignity and honor. The samurai sword was very much about honor, and a shaven head essentially said that you were dignified and ready to die for your country. And then this metaphor here, a shaven head full of powerful incantations. Incantations being somewhat essentially spells or prayers, I suppose. And actually what I think you could see this as a metaphor for is the patriotism and honour, the ritualistic nature of kamikaze pilots, but the indoctrination of the soldier, this idea that he's not necessarily thinking his own thoughts, he's thinking about what he's being told. This idea, almost like being brainwashed, I suppose. So there's a lack of control. We get this sense that the kamikaze pilot wasn't necessarily doing what they thought as humans were right, but actually, doing it for honor and being told that it was honorable. And enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. That use of one way highlights the ominous nature of the role, that he won't be coming back. There's no return. Now, what you'll discover in this poem is that this kamikaze pilot does return, which is quite interesting. And then this one-way journey into history, this is the metaphor essentially for patriotism and honour that they should feel. The journey into history, to be infamous, to be legendary in remembrance. And again, we have this link to the power of memory. They did this for the honour and to be considered honourable men. I'm just going to go through and highlight my key techniques. I apologise for the blurriness. I've zoomed in quite a lot today, so it picks up my hand quite a lot, but hopefully you can see just fine. Okay, so next stanza. But halfway there she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boat strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. So that but is a tonal shift here because it signifies a contradiction to the previous stanza. So in the previous stanza it was he was doing this and he was doing this, and it ends with a one-way journey into history. The use of the connective but makes us feel that that's not what happened. But we're reminded that this is what she thought, but halfway there she thought. It's reinforcing his lack of voice. It's her testimony and her need to make sense of his decisions and actions. So we don't know if halfway there he looked far down. This is what his daughter thinks. And that's a really odd feeling because it's not meant for us to not trust what she's saying, more to question why it's not fact, that she doesn't know that's what happened. So we question the relationship, I suppose. And again, he must have looked down. There's an assumption here as opposed to knowing. I think looked far down. Obviously, his job is to search for ships. So that's why he's up in the sky flying over and he's looking down. But I think that also this could be symbolic of him searching for answers or a sign. And we see this quite commonly in our war poems that we've studied. This idea of the soldier trying to make sense of what they are doing. So even this pilot who's completely indoctrinated and has one job to do, potentially is searching for purpose. And then we have the simile at the little fishing boat strung out like bunting. So bunting are the sort of strings of flags almost. We use them for birthdays quite often, but celebrations definitely, or festivities in some way. I think this is quite an ambiguous simile because on the one hand, is Garland suggesting to us that when he looks down at those fishing boats strung out like bunting, that they look like bunting because they're celebrating his honour and patriotism? So he looks at it and sees that he's doing the right thing. Or do the fishing boats that are strung out like bunting make him think about this celebration of life and not death? So he looks down at nature and the world as he flies over and sees this kind of celebration. Is it a celebration of life? And essentially that's something he won't be able to celebrate anymore. So potentially we see him changing his mind, potentially not. We have the green-blue translucent sea. Translucent meaning you can partly see through it, partly not. So maybe this is a moment of clarity. It's symbolic of that. But also this vivid colour imagery, the vibrancy of life and nature. Garland uses colour really well and texture in this poem. And I think that's to give us this tangible sense of what the pilot was feeling as he flew over the world that he lives in, and planning obviously not to be in it anymore because that's his job. The next stanza then, and beneath them arcing in swathes like a huge flag waved first one way, then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swiveled towards the sun. So swathes are wraps or binds and are usually wound quite tightly. So potentially here, this idea of feeling trapped. And then we have the simile, like a huge flag waved first one way. So this is the shoals of fishes moving in the sea when they move all together. So the flag actually is symbolic of patriotism. When you do something for the flag, it's like doing it for your country. So potentially here, this symbol is suggesting to us that he's trapped by his cultural identity. He sees the flag in things that are not a flag. So he's looking at fish and sees the flag as a reminder that he should be doing that. This is reinforced with the figure of 8, which is the infinity symbol. And that essentially represents being trapped or being in something perpetual. So it's never ending. A figure of 8 doesn't end. It doesn't have a stop. It just is infinity. I think the dark shoals of fishes could be a metaphor for his aircraft. So because they're flashing their silver bellies, it's almost like the fish mimic his journey, but their collective movement contrasts his isolation. So while this shoal of fish move like his aircraft maybe is over the sea, they move through the sea like it, but they work together as a group, as a team, and actually he has to do this job on his own. He's in isolation. So while they may, the shape may be mimicking him, it's also heightening the fact that he's isolated, which is interesting. And the fact that they swivel their bellies towards the sun, so almost like towards him, as if they're worshipping him, they turn their bellies towards him collectively. But also what we could see this is symbolic of being blinded. So pilots, a tactic was to try and get pilots to fly close to the sun to blind them, essentially. So could this also potentially be symbolic of him being blinded with this kind of realization of his indoctrination? They swivel their bellies towards the sun. He looks at the sun. It's almost like a symbol of, again, clarity or being blinded by conflict. Final stanza on this page. And remembered how he had, while I highlight, I'll just read this. And remembered how he had his brothers waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe. So first of all is that word remembered. We get a link to power of memory. Essentially, when you look at from the beginning of this poem to now, this pilot has embarked and is flying over the ocean, and all of these memories are flooding in. So to note about this stanza as well, stanza 4, there is no punctuation and only enjambment. So it's almost like the outpouring of memory, and also the speed of his journey, because remember, this would have been quick. He would be flying quite fast. So we're getting a sense of how quickly his thoughts are happening, but also how much he's suddenly he's flooded with memory. So we have the flooding of words on the page become the flooding of memory. Cairns are mounds of stones, which generally were built as memorials. So he's remembering this time when him and his brothers would be on the shore, and they would build these cairns of pearl grey pebbles to see whose would stay up the longest. And I think that the concept that nature lasts, this idea that maybe it's an indicator of life rather than death. So he's having this memory of him and his brothers building these cairns, and they're meant to stand the test of time. That was the goal of them. And essentially that contradicts him as a person. He's not meant to stand the test of time. He's meant to die for honor. So there's that real sort of contrast. And again, the word longest here linking to that. We then have the turbulent inrush of breakers bringing their father's boat safe. So I think that this is symbolic of his emotions, the turbulent inrush of breakers. So this idea of the waves crashing in. Maybe the memories are crashing in and his emotions are changing. He's meant to have a one-track mind and just go and get his job done. But actually, he's remembering all of these wonderful things about his life. He's looking down and appreciating nature. And the mention of the word safe here, his memory is of safety, which obviously he's not in a situation where he's safe. So this juxtaposes what he's about to do or should do. And that's quite important as well. We have to remember that these are not the thoughts of somebody who seems happy to die. It seems like his mind and his memories are clouding that judgment. And maybe trying to tell him something, like I said, to embark on an adventure, maybe of self-discovery, but definitely reinforcing that theme of the power of memory. So as we move on to the final stanzas, just make sure you take a moment to make sure you've got all of this down. Okay. Really interesting structural features coming up here. So first of all, we have, yes, grandfather's boat, safe. The shore sodden awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of white bait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. So we have first-person narrative here, which is emphasised by the parenthesis and the italics. So this is the daughter's voice. Yes, grandfather's boat, because it's not, she's clearly talking to her children and telling a story, which fits in with this kind of narrative poem. The parenthesis highlights that this is her voice and her memory, and that he is passed on through memory. It tells us that he's not around potentially, which will become more important as you read the final parts of this poem, where it does take quite a sad turn actually in terms of the story. So it was third person narrative focalized through the daughter. Now this is first person narrative just for one line, and then it goes back into third person. So we get this switch of narrative, which shows us the layer of memory, which is really cool. The repetition of safe reinforces what he didn't have or what he longed for. And I'm just going to pop in here that there is some sibilance. Safe to the shore, salt sodden awash. I think that this sibilance mimics the sound of waves. So that's what it does. Why it does it, I think, is because it's symbolic that just like waves, the pilot is going to return. So remember, he's not meant to. He's a kamikaze pilot. His job is to go and not come back. But we get this sibilance that, and we're getting this feeling from him anyway, that he's not going to go through with it, which is exactly what happens, which you'll see. So we have this list here of all of the different fish and sea life. And I think that it's showing us, on the one hand, the diversity and beauty of nature. It's showing him what he will miss. He's looking down at the ocean and seeing and remembering sort of, being on his dad's boat. We get a lot of textures and colours here. We get the vibrancy of nature. So again, if you were using this to comment on nature and the power of nature, you could use this poem. I don't think it's the easiest poem to use, but you could definitely use it. Hopefully you can see why. Whitebait, just out of interest, is a small immature fish. Maybe the mention of that is telling us something. Maybe symbolic of him in some way. And then we have the metaphor, a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. It takes quite a dark tone. It's a bit odd, really, that it features, but I think this could be the threat of duty. So what he sort of almost does, he snap back to, but remember, you're meant to be brave and strong and honourable. So it mentions this tuna. Or it could be the manifestation of the decision not to continue. So he sees the tuna and sees it as this dark prince, muscular and dangerous. Maybe he sees the tuna in that way because that's the manifestation of his brain coming to the realization that he's not going to go through with committing suicide, essentially, for the sake of his country. I actually want to add as well, with that list, that they're all things that can be caught. So if he's on his dad's boat, chances are they were fishermen. So these are all things that can be caught in a net. So maybe they're also symbolic of being trapped and out of control, which is exactly how he feels: trapped in duty, trapped in honour, in cultural identity and tradition. So I'm just going to pop that down there as well. Okay, so now we move into a very different part of the story. And though he came back, and you'll see that everything is written in italics here, so this is the daughter's voice. And though he came back, should be positive that he came back, but because of the word though, it foreshadows that there's something negative. So he came back, but is another way that this could have been said. So we get this sense that something's not quite right. And then we have this horrible line. It's so sad in the story. My mother never spoke again in his presence. So we have my mother never spoke again. Next line, in his presence. So the enjambment highlights his isolation. He has become a pariah. He's been shunned by his family because there is no honour in living when you're a kamikaze pilot. They treated him as though he no longer existed. This is completely ironic. He has a moment of realization when he's in his plane that he chooses to live, he chooses to exist. But because of this cultural tradition and the conditioning that people will have received about kamikaze pilots and how it was dishonorable to not, die for your country, it's prevented him from actually living or existing. So he exists in memory only in the form of this poem and his daughter's words. So it's really ironic, tragic irony, absolutely. He chooses to live, but then doesn't. We then have enjambment that runs through these two lines. So only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent. So in the first stanza here, they still talk and laugh with him. But then in the next stanza, even though the sentence carries on, it changes. It highlights the shift between childhood innocence and adult corruption or judgment. They go from still seeing him as their father to clearly then having it passed down from their mother, for example, that they shouldn't be still talking and laughing to him. They should be shunning him because he's a pariah. It's really sad. It's the power of memory, because right or wrong, it's passed down. So you imagine this story of their father, who was meant to die honourably, chooses not to and becomes dishonourable. And then it just gets even sadder, to live as though he had never returned. So this is how they all act. The cultural tradition, there is only honour in his death. The fact that he's alive means nothing to them. He should live, and they should live as if he didn't return. So they treat him as if he's dead, essentially. No longer the father we loved. So love is sacrificed for the sake of honour. You're not honourable anymore, so we can't love you anymore. You're dead to us. It's so, so sad. And sometimes she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. I mean, what an ending to a poem. We have that assumption again, reinforces the fact we don't hear from him. We're disconnected from the Kamikaze pilot. So we actually feel the disconnect that the daughter and the mother created and felt. We don't know him. We don't know how he felt. We know how she thinks he felt. And it ends with, which had been the better way to die. It's a very somber tone. It highlights the futility of violence, the harsh reality of war. And I think the burden of cultural identity, which would have been the better way to die, to die before you feel you're ready, but be honourable, or to come back and live only to be treated as if you died. And that's what her mother had said. And sometimes she said he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. And we end with the final two stanzas in italics, signifying the first person narrative and also highlighting that he stopped existing. So before, it was all third person, apart from that one line, that essentially was keeping his memory alive. And then it's all her talking about what happened when he came back. And actually, when he came back, he, as they knew him, ceased to exist. He didn't exist anymore for the sake of honour, which is just so very sad. So I've only got one other feature to write about at the bottom, but it's quite a big one because I haven't mentioned it throughout. So make sure you've got some space. So the other feature that I want to talk about is the punctuation and the sentences. So take the parenthesis out of it. If you actually look at the poem, there are only 3 sentences in this entire poem. And the first sentence actually spans over 5 stanzas. So all of the stanzas on page 1 and then the first stanza on the second page. So during his journey, from the moment he wakes up and boards his plane to all of the memories he has and the things he sees, the nature he sees, and then clearly, although it doesn't say it explicitly, his decision to return. That's one sentence long. So I think that heightens the pace at which the memories flowed and how quickly he changed his mind, because it would have had to be quick. And so the fact that one sentence spans 5 stanzas reinforces this idea of the power of memories and the power of nature. Such a powerful thing, essentially. And then we have the final 2 sentences are closer together because they occur in the final 2 stanzas. So the pace changes as the memories of him cease to exist, because obviously he ceases to exist. They don't have more memories of him post return. The only memories are from before. So he no longer existed when he came back. So the structure reinforces the tragedy of this story. And there we are, all done. So hopefully you have something that looks a little bit like this. If we talk about the story first, so this is a story of a kamikaze pilot who wakes up and boards his plane, essentially to go and dive bomb into an enemy ship, knowing that he will die at the end of it, for honour. It was a very honourable thing. That's what they were told. It was very honourable to die for your country and for the purpose of your country. As he's flying over the ocean, he starts to notice the picturesque and beautiful vibrancy of nature. And these things that he sees trigger memories in his mind, particularly of playing with his brothers, of being on his father's boat. And whatever it is, something changes his mind and he decides to return. Now, we don't get explicitly told that, apart from at the beginning of the 6th stanza, where the daughter says, "And though he came back." So that's our indicator that he did. But previous to that, we don't know that that's what he's done. We make the assumption because the story that's being told suggests that he's looking at, you know, all of these things around him and seeing the vibrancy of life and almost convincing himself that what he's about to do isn't worth it. And that's, you know, he's not the first soldier to question that, as we know from our studies. So, and then the story finishes essentially with us understanding that when he returned, he was shunned by his family, he was ignored, he wasn't treated well, and so died alone, essentially. And we are left with this final thought of which would have been the better way to die, which is a very harsh thought to consider. In terms of the theme, obviously we have the power of memory. The fact that we have the daughter's memory of her father and her father's memory. So the idea that memory spans time. So even if a person ceases to exist, that their memory lives on. So memory is powerful. We also have the fact that it is the kamikaze pilot's memory that changes his mind, and it's a huge decision that's made in a really short period of time. We have this constant flow of memories because of the enjambment and lack of punctuation that reinforce that. In terms of the reality of war and the lasting impact, obviously the lasting impact being that if you don't do it for honor, you're, you know, being dishonorable essentially, and how that impacts a soldier's life. And actually, as a human, to consider that he didn't want to do it, I don't think makes him a bad person. But I'm also not from that culture, and I don't understand the honor of it. But everybody within that culture would have. So he actually broke rules, you know. So this idea of war controlling human life, because remember, they're not just soldiers, they are humans. It's about that humanity. So war actually takes away people's humanity. And obviously the lasting impact is that his life was never the same. And the power of cultural identity, I think this really does. You have the opening stanza, which shows us all of these really powerful images of a kamikaze pilot and presents him godlike and pure and patriotic in his demeanor. We also have then the power of cultural identity of how he's treated when he comes back. The fact that wife and children switched off their feelings for him in the name of cultural identity, essentially, that cultural identity in this poem is stronger, and cultural tradition is stronger than love and care. So that's how it links to theme. I think the message here is essentially we have this idea of the futility of violence, that, again, like I said, the humanity of it all. He actually does the human thing, not the soldier thing, and is punished for it. So I think that Garland's making a point here of, that what is honorable about that. Honorable, difficult word to say, apparently. What is honorable about not being appreciated for not taking your life? That war actually, and conflict and violence, corrupt the way people see the world. For his wife to just never speak again in his presence is just, that impact of war. I think that she's making a point about the power of memories. I mean, when we take the character of the daughter's voice, why is she talking about this memory? Does she long? Does she regret? Maybe there's this idea of memory. Memory sparks emotion for us, and in some senses, if we think about memory, it's full of regrets potentially. And so maybe she's saying something about how, don't underestimate the power of memory, and how things you have done previously will haunt you somewhat if they weren't the right thing to do. But I think she's definitely making a point here about the power of a culture, and that your identity stems from where you are from and the traditions of your culture. Now, you may not feel like you have traditions in your culture. Maybe you do. Maybe you really see those. But there are definitely different rules and expectations and morals in different cultures. And this is potentially one you or I don't understand. And Beatrice Garland instantly wouldn't. She's not Japanese. So, but has come to understand. And as I said, this cultural divide between the East and the West, this idea that actually cultures across the world have every right to be their culture. But there is a slight criticism, obviously, of this idea of how far do you let your cultural identity take over your life? Should it? It leaves us with questions, I think, of what's right and wrong when it comes to our cultural identity. I think that's quite interesting. Okay, let's move on to the questions. Question number 1, what is the impact of the narrative voice being the daughter? So really think about, for you, why is that? What's the impact of that? Why is that different than if it would have been him telling his story? Why do you think Garland references nature so much? When you think about her message, why does she have so much imagery of nature? Question 3, how does the structure of the poem affect its meaning or message? So look at your italics, look at the sentences, and consider how that impacts the meaning or message of the poem. Question 4, how does the imagery in the first stanza convey the power of cultural identity? Not does it, how does it? So try to explain that. And the final question, question 5, what quotation would you use to help you make the point that war is oppressive? Now, we haven't used the word oppressive. I'm throwing a bit of a tricky question in there, but as we're moving through this, you do need to up your game when it comes to really engaging with this. So if you were going to make a point about war being oppressive, what quotation would you use to help you make that point?